The following video contains real war stories. It contains graphic descriptions and mature language. The views and opinions expressed within do not represent the ones held by Interpo's finest. Viewer discretion is advised. It wasn't called World War Zero for nothing, by the way. From a strategic perspective, this war is considered to be one of the most dangerous ones that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. The outside world followed it with great enthusiasm because it took place between an old and well-established empire that sat on the throne of Central Asia and wanted to annex more of the lands of East Asia, and a young one that developed itself at an extremely rapid pace, while also wanted to impose itself on the Asian scene and hang with the big boys, which at that time included Britain, France, and Germany, who were considered at that time the most powerful countries in the world. This war was also followed by many military experts from other countries because it was considered to be one of the first wars in which modern weapon technology was used and in which exceptional circumstances that had not been seen before took place. Welcome to the Russo-Japanese War. The story of the Japanese Empire's rise to dominance in Asia is one of the most thrilling and exciting stories in history. When Emperor Meiji ascended to power in Japan in 1861, he made massive and radical changes and reforms in the Japanese way of living that included all fields of life, from politics and economics to the army and also art and education. Modernization of Japanese society and state aimed to protect Japan from the threat of external occupation and also to strengthen the country in order to compete with the European empires for the throne of Asia, which at that time was mostly controlled by Europeans, such as British India, French Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. After Meiji's success in modernizing the country, the idea of making Japan an imperialist power did not leave the minds of the elite surrounding Meiji, as they convinced him that Japan had the right to dominate people who, in their view, were less valuable and civilized than the Japanese, and by this they meant the Korean and Chinese people. Influenced by the Darwinian thought imported from Europe at that time due to modernization, which it emphasizes on the survival of the fittest, as the then Japanese Foreign Minister Inoue Kaura said in 1887. As a result, Japan began its imperialist campaign, seizing the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, the Pescadores Island, and the Liaodong Peninsula in 1895 after winning a decisive war against the Chinese Qing dynasty. This war opened the appetite of the ruling elite, including Emperor Meiji, to annex more Asian territories and expand, especially in Chinese Manchuria, but European countries, led by Russia, forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. This greatly angered the Japanese, and Japanese hostility towards the Russians began to grow and intensify day after day. Russia also has a long history of expansionism in the 19th century, as it wiped out many Islamic emirates and khanates in Central Asia from the map and committed many genocidal and ethnic cleansing campaigns against the Circassian people in the Caucasus during the century-long Russian-Circassian conflict. Before its success in Central Asia, Russia had always set its sights on Chinese Manchuria and targeted many ports located in it, such as Port Arthur, because it did not have enough warm-weather ports to facilitate maritime navigation for the Russian commercial and military ships. Taking advantage of China's weakness, Russia concluded many unequal treaties in 1896 and 1898 with the Qing dynasty, allowing Russia to use Chinese ports, especially Port Arthur located on the Liaodong Peninsula, while also building Russian military bases in Manchuria and linking the Trans-Siberian Railway to to the coasts of the Pacific Ocean. As a result, Russia greatly strengthened its presence in Manchuria, especially after its intervention to suppress the Boxer Rebellion in 1899 in China. The Russian influence in Korea began to grow after the Korean king in 1896 took refuge in one of the buildings that belonged to the Russian diplomatic mission after the end of the Sino-Japanese War for fear of being arrested by the Japanese armed forces that were present in Korea and occupying it at that time, which Japan announced as its own sphere of influence. After this incident, the Korean ruling elite saw that Russia could protect the weaker Korea from the Japanese occupation, and in order to encourage the Russians to do so, Korean government at that time granted contracts and exploitation licenses to the Russian mining companies in front of the Yalu and Tumen rivers, which increased the anger of the Japanese more and more. Long story short, there are two events that contributed to the deterioration of Japanese-Russian relations. First, Russia forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China after the war, and second, the growing Russian influence in Korea. After the events that took place, the Japanese ruling elite were divided between proponents and opponents of the war against Russia to impose its influence on Korea and neighboring regions. But Japanese politicians agreed to start negotiations before fighting, hoping to reach an agreement with the Russian Tsar without any human and material losses. In August 1903, the Japanese envoy to the Russian capital, St. Petersburg, Korino Shinichiro, delivered a document to the Russian authorities stating, "2 months later, Russia responded through its envoy to Tokyo City, Roman Rosen, with a document that stated, After that, secret negotiations continued between the two countries, but by January 1904, Japan realized that Russia was not serious about finding realistic solutions, and it was only trying to buy time through diplomacy to prepare itself militarily, especially since it was procrastinating greatly in responding to the Japanese proposals. On February 4, 1904, Japan was waiting for Russia's response to its proposals regarding finding solutions to the crisis, but to no avail. Consequently, Japanese patience ran out, and Emperor Meiji announced the severing of diplomatic relations with Russia on February 6, 1904, and declared war on the Russians after the severance on February 9, 1904. The war in reality began after Japan declared war on Russia on February 9, 1904. But it is worth noting that one day before the declaration, Japanese naval forces launched a violent attack on their Russian counterparts in the forts of Port Arthur without any warning. The Battle of Port Arthur was the first confrontation in the Russo-Japanese War, and it has seen very limited use of equipment and witnessed few losses, as fighting was limited between the two sides due to the lack of knowledge and intelligence of the opponent, and unpreparedness on the Japanese side and on the Russian side, which caused hesitation and withholding the armies from carrying out any major attacks. Between February and April 1904, fighting was still limited between the Russians and the Japanese, as both sides were busy collecting intelligence and information about the enemy. Japan landed its forces in Chimoplu on February 12th, and the Japanese Navy carried out only 3 attacks, the most notable of which were the blockade attempt on Port Arthur on February 24th, the bombardment of the city of Vladivostok on March 6th, and a second blockade attempt on Port Arthur on March 24th, but all 3 maneuvers did not yield any significant results. The Battle of Yalu River was the first land battle that took place between the Russian and Japanese armies, as it took place between April 25th and May 2nd, 1904. It also witnessed a very strong and fierce fighting, unlike the first months of the war. The Russian leadership was astonished by the fighting spirit of the Japanese soldiers, as they showed unparalleled courage. Their intense enthusiasm and will to fight led to Japan's victory in this battle, where they inflicted massive losses in the Russian ranks, estimated at more than 2,000 casualties between dead, wounded, captured, and missing. Russia consequently withdrew from the river. On May 5th, the Japanese army landed troops on the Liaodong Peninsula, and the Japanese Navy received a painful blow after 2 of its warships sank as a result of them being hit by Russian mines on May 16th. On the other hand, the 2 armies fought in Nanshan between May 25th and 26th, and the Russian forces withdrew from the city of Telisu, located in southern Manchuria, on June 15th after a fierce battle. Misfortunes continued to befall Russia during July 1904, after they failed to retake the Motian Pass from the Japanese, and the latter attempting a 3rd blockade on Port Arthur that will last for more than 3 months. The 3rd siege of Port Arthur witnessed the most violent and ferocious clashes in the Russo-Japanese War. The battle also witnessed the use of modern military technologies that had not been used before in previous wars, such as the bolt-action magazine rifles, barbed wire entanglements, electric fences, arc lamp, searchlights, tactical radio signaling, and hand grenades. The siege officially began on August 1st and continued until the surrender of the Russian forces on January 2nd, 1905, who were met by a strong fighting spirit of the Japanese soldiers. Both sides suffered very large human losses, estimated at more than 150,000 people, both sides combined, between killed and wounded. After the surrender of Russian naval forces at the siege of Port Arthur, Russian soldiers' morale declined, as they were no longer able to fight with such ferocity and enthusiasm that they were known for in the past, especially the Cossacks. As morale declined, series of Russian defeats continued to appear on the horizon. The most prominent ones were in the Battle of Mukden and Tsushima. The Battle of Mukden, located in southern Manchuria, began on February 20th, 1905, and ended by a Russian defeat on March 10th at the hands of the Japanese, forcing them to withdraw and relocate to northern Manchuria after suffering losses estimated at 8,000 dead, 51,000 wounded, and more than 27,000 missing. Between March and May 1905, the intensity of the battles between the Japanese and Russian armies declined due to the severe fatigue of soldiers on both sides, plus the attrition of most of their financial resources on previous battles. The Battle of Tsushima, which was the last major battle, took place between the Japanese naval forces and their Russian counterparts between the 27th and 28th of May 1905, in which Russia suffered another huge loss in its naval armada, losing 6 warships and 1 frigate, while the Japanese seized 2 others. After the Battle of Sakhalin in July 1905, which ended in a landslide victory for Japan, the Russian and Japanese diplomatic delegations met in the American state of Maine under U.S. mediation and the presence of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Negotiations to end the war began on August 9, 1905, after the Russian side lost several battles and the Japanese became exhausted and depleted most of their financial and material resources. On September 5th, the two came out with an agreement stipulating an end to the war with a decisive Japanese victory, which we will talk about in detail in the post-war results section. The biggest supporters of Russia were Germany and France, as it is worth noting that the German Emperor Wilhelm II was the cousin of Russian Tsar Nicholas II. On the political level, Germany supported Russia's ambitions in East Asia in hopes of keeping it out of the European stage, and it always stated that Russia was the main protector of the white race from the yellow peril, in a reference to the skin color of Asians, and that Russia is considered as Europe's eyes and ears in East Asia. During the 1890s, the German media used to spread the yellow peril propaganda on a very large scale. This propaganda had a racist root, as it belittled and mocked the Asian race. France was the main financial backer of the Russian government during the war, due to the formation of an alliance between them during the end of the 19th century, aimed at balancing against the Triple Alliance formed in 1882, which included Germany, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As for the military aspect, the alliance was intended only for Europe and not for any other part of the world, as was stated by the French Prime Minister at the time, Maurice Rouvier. In other words, France wasn't going to intervene militarily on Russia's side because the war didn't take place on European soil. Although Russian Finance Minister Sergei Witte carried out remarkable reforms in Russia's financial sector since 1897, through introducing the gold standard and encouraging the consumption of Russian goods by implementing protectionist policies through customs, all these efforts weren't enough to raise money, as Russia was forced to obtain foreign loans from other countries. The war cost the Russian treasury about 6 billion rubles, of which 4 billion rubles belonged to foreign loans, and 3 of which were contributed by French investors. Although it is worth stating that Britain launched a propaganda attack on Russia's unstable financial situation in order to intimidate investors and keep them away from giving any loans to Russia due to its alliance with Japan in 1902. The Russian Tsarist government used soft and hard means in order to mobilize its army and send it to fight in the Far East, as it used to spread huge propaganda to gain Russian people's sympathy for the cause by using posters that exaggerated the power of Russian soldiers and belittled their Japanese counterparts, while it also used force, as it approved and implemented compulsory conscription throughout all Russian territory. But the surrender of the Russian Navy in the siege of Port Arthur was the flame that lit the fire of the popular revolution against the Tsarist rule of Russia, known as the 1905 Revolution, which included demonstrations, strikes, and soldiers' mutinies against the instructions of the Russian military leadership. It is worth noting that some Chinese living in Manchuria participated alongside the Russians as mercenaries. The biggest supporters of Japan during the war were the United States and Britain, who provided financial, logistical, media, and intelligence support from the beginning. The reason America supported Japan lied in its desire to maintain the huge trade relations between the two countries, and the reason for Britain's support for Japan was due to the alliance concluded between the two countries in 1902. Japan not only achieved victory in the military field, but also in the financial field, as the Japanese government succeeded in obtaining loans to finance its military campaign against Russia from American banks located on Wall Street and British banks in London. The Russo-Japanese War contributed to the entrance of the largest American banks such as J.P. Morgan and Lehman Brothers in the global financial markets for the first time. Japan relied heavily on indoctrinating its soldiers to honor death while fighting and not to surrender to the enemy under any circumstance, because the most honorable thing for a human being, according to their belief, is to die fighting, which explains the huge will and enthusiasm with which the Japanese soldiers fought, which were one of the reasons that made Japan win over an opponent who was militarily stronger than it, at least on paper. On the other hand, The Japanese authorities itself spread propaganda stating that Japan is a civilized country trying to protect Asia from Russian barbarism, as it was stated in the book History of Warfare, the Russo-Japanese War in Global Perspective. It is worth noting that some Koreans and Chinese who lived in Manchuria have participated alongside the Japanese also as mercenaries. Ceasefire negotiations began between the Russian and Japanese delegations at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, located in the state of Maine under American mediation on August 9, 1905, during which the Japanese delegations made 4 demands. First, Russia's recognition that Korea would be under Japan's sphere of influence in the future. Second, the withdrawal of Russian forces from Manchuria and the cession of all Russian economic privileges inside Manchuria to Japan. Third, Russia's cession of Sakhalin Island to Japan. Fourth, imposing war indemnities on Russia. The Russian delegation agreed to most of the Japanese demands except for namely the third and fourth. In return, Russia agreed to give up only the southern half of Sakhalin Island and did not agree to pay any war indemnity to the Japanese. This counter-proposal was immediately rejected by the Japanese Foreign Minister Komura. Realizing that the Japanese wouldn't be able to continue fighting after suffering massive material and human losses, Russian Finance Minister Sergei Witte threatened to continue the war if Japan did not agree on the Russian counter-proposal, which forced Komura to accept it. On September 5, 1905, the two parties agreed to a permanent ceasefire in exchange for, first, Russia's recognition that Korea would be under Japan's sphere of influence, second, the withdrawal of Russian forces from Manchuria and the cession of all Russian economic privileges inside Manchuria to Japan, third, Russian cession of the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan, fourth, Japan abandons its demands to receive war indemnities from Russia. Because of his diplomatic efforts and success in stopping the war, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt received the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize. For your information, both Russia and Japan have signed and ratified the Hague Treaty of 1899, which clarifies the laws of war and imposes them on the countries that signed it. To answer the question, there is no strong evidence showing whether both parties respected or didn't respect the treaty during the war, but Japanese historian Yuki Tanaka stated that more than 70,000 Russian prisoners who fell into the hands of the Japanese army were released by the Japanese authorities, and in addition to that, they were also rewarded with money for the services they provided for the benefit of Japan, such as digging the ground, cleaning the prison camps, and etc. This war presented Japan as a new imperial power who's capable of competing with the major European powers for dominance of Asia. It also cemented in people's minds an image of the Japanese fighter who's fierce, courageous, and is not afraid of death. Japan's victory over Russia surprised many military experts around the world at that time, given Russia's superiority over Japan in terms of the amount of equipment and weapons, but it was the superiority of the Japanese soldiers' fighting spirit over their Russian counterparts that made the difference on the battlefield. Japanese diplomats cleverly exploited their military victories in order to impose their own terms, and were flexible in their dealings with their Russian counterparts. Despite their victories on the battlefield, they remained open to negotiations and did not close any of its doors in the face of Russian diplomats. They realized that the military option is only one of the many tools to achieve the geopolitical desires of the Japanese state, and it is not the main and only tool, and that the goal of the war is to pressure Russia into accepting Japan's desires and not to destroy the entire Russian army. In other words, they put the political goals of the Japanese state before the military goals. This is the correct way of thinking for a sound and robust foreign policy. The state must always try to achieve its foreign policy goals with the lowest possible cost, and it is known that military pressure has a higher cost compared to negotiations, making compromises, and diplomacy. But bringing the two together, meaning diplomacy and military pressure, will provide the negotiating state with endless number of opportunities to achieve its desires in international relations.